Freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously, without instruction.
See what the Empire has done to your lives? Your families and your freedom?
Good people will fight if we lead them.
The rebellion is spreading.
Now we take the war to them.
The Republic will be reorganized
Systems either change or die.
into the first.
You give way to an enemy this evil with this much power, and you condemn the galaxy to an eternity of submission.
And wake up. There is one way. Now fighting from the start.
Long live the Empire!
Fight the Empire!
Let's call it war.
Remember this. Try.
Hey, Ellie.
Hi, Sophie.
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Duke.
Duke who?
Welcome to Daughters of Ferrix, your home for all the strange convergences between my various insane interests and Star Wars. I'm your host, Sophia Dunstan, and with me is my fabulous co-host, Eleanor Mueller.
That's not my name! You have known me for far too long to get my name wrong every time.
I'm sorry, Eleanor Mueller.
Thank you.
Joining us from her now mostly assembled apartment at an undisclosed location in Portland. Ellie, how's life?
Yeah, no, it's fully disclosed. You can find me at 70th Gleason Street. I'm on the north west corner. So send me all of your mail and explosive devices. I would love to see them. No, I don't know. Life is good. I live in a beautiful city that pretends to care about the people that live in it. How's life for you, Sophie?
Well, I live in a beautiful city that doesn't pretend to care about the people that live in it, so the honesty is refreshing at least.
Real quick, I'd like to thank Lewis Holding and Connor Butler for their generous support over on Patreon. You are all the conveniently empty airstrip that prevents this crashing flagship of a show from killing millions. If you, our listener, are interested in early access to episodes, outtakes, the Daughters of Ferrix Discord server, and the expectation of monthly bonus episodes, check us out at patreon.com/Daughters of Ferrix.
Do it.
Yeah, please. Anyway, so George Lucas went through a lot of ideas in working on Star Wars' original trilogy, right? One of them being the concept of the Imperial homeworld. In one iteration of Episode 4, that capital was Alderaan, actually. In early versions of Episode 6, a major focal location was to be the Imperial city world called Had Abaddon, which, it makes sense for the nature versus industry theme that Star Wars sometimes played with. But eventually, that city world was deemed too difficult to realize on screen in the early 80s. So that was nixed. But the concept never really died. The Imperial City world was mentioned in comics. It was brought up again in the West End Games TTRPG source books, which began in 1987. The source books that became the key world building source for Timothy Zahn with the ushering in of the first wave of the expanded universe alongside Heir to the Empire in 1991. And that is where the Galactic Capital got a proper identity. At Star Wars Celebration in 2005, Zahn explained, "Nobody names a planet Imperial Planet, so I thought it needed a name. I picked the word that means glittering." Apparently, when it came time to choose a name for the films, people persuaded George to go with Coruscant and be done with it.
I personally would actually name a planet Imperial Planet. I'm like some hyper functionalist guy.
Yeah, Imperial Sovereign Planet 4.
That's a very much like a Japanese naming convention, right?
I was thinking it was pretty Dune.
It is also quite Dune.
Because they call the planet Dune.
Hey, this planet has sand dunes on it. Let's just call it that because we're lazy.
They didn't call it Sand Dune. They just called it those dunes. Those dunes could be made of anything. Anyway, so Coruscant at this point was already well established in publishing Dark Empire, Tales of the Jedi, before the first appearance of Coruscant in the films, which was a single shot in the 1997 special edition re-release of Return of the Jedi, which usher in this starring role in The Phantom Menace 2 years later, and the other prequels after that. It was the most prominent setting in the Clone Wars, and the location of George Lucas's canceled live-action television series Underworld. And while it took a back seat from the new canon in the 2010s, it is now back in full force. It featured in Andor, The Mandalorian, Jedi Survivor. In the past few decades, Coruscant has become one of the single most important planets in the series, which is what you get for being the seat of power in the Galactic Republic. It's Imperial Center, the jewel of the core worlds, the bright center to the universe, but it's also a city. A violently massive city. It is filled with people living their lives, and it has to function somehow. Welcome to our episode about Coruscant, a non-comprehensive overview of the worst place in the galaxy to live.
I take like massive exception to that. It is not the worst place in the galaxy to live.
Where's worse?
I don't know. Kessel, perhaps, where everyone is a slave and the sky is orange.
Some people own the slaves, Sophie, you know?
Okay, but I feel like a majority
Have you considered identifying with the slave owners?
I had not, but apparently you have. So I'm glad we're getting some breadth of political views on this podcast finally.
Yeah, it's nice to have dissenting opinions, such as, I don't know if slaves are people. Enslaved people, fun fact, are people. I shouldn't have to tell you that.
Transgender people, on the other hand, are not.
Yeah, heavily in question. For any new listeners, Sophia and I are both transgender women. We are making jokes about our own social class. All right, Sophia, before we get to Coruscant itself, can you tell our listeners what it means to be an urbanist?
In the classic sense, right, to be an urbanist is to be someone who appreciates, I don't know, the kind of ways in which people interact with each other in cities, right? Like, oh, look at all of these super unique and complex systems that exist when a whole bunch of people come together and build a place. In the more modern sense, it's like advocating for a city to be less car, more person, basically, you know, like sustainable transportation, housing supply issues, things like that.
Reject car, embrace feet.
Embrace tradition, yeah.
Embrace monkey, become monkey.
Reject car, embrace tradition, basically, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, what's the word that means city? It's like ecufascism.
Disturbingly similar to fascism, which I believe we've discussed before. Wasn't it Echo Umberto?
It is Umberto Eco.
Yeah, and you said like eco-fascism.
No, it's that's eco-fascism. I said ecu-fascism. So you have Eco's fascism, you have eco-fascism, and ecu-fascism. These are all distinct things. You will be quizzed about this at the end of the class.
If you're a person who's interested in cities and all the kind of social interactions they produce, Coruscant, right?
It's a fucking disaster.
Well, Ellie, you live in Portland, so watch it. You're going to tell me that there is no like similar problem structure in American cities than there is to Coruscant? Like, ma'am.
No, I hate American cities. What are you talking about?
Okay, well, there we go.
There is no more American city than Coruscant.
That might be true, unfortunately. So, Coruscant, right? By far the most populated planet in the galaxy, situated at the beating heart of the inhabited universe. And while it's not actually situated at the very center of the galaxy, it is one of the oldest and most important core worlds. It's probable that Coruscant is the point of origin for the human species and one of the galaxy's most important civilizational cradles. In legends, the humans went on to defeat the Tongs and the Zell, also native to the planet, and gain full control of the surface. Mass urbanization began soon after the human consolidation, and colonization expeditions were launched to nearby habitable worlds such as Alderaan and Alsakan, beginning sometime around 27,000 BBY.
And many have considered it a bad idea since.
This was widely considered to be a bad move.
Thank you, yeah.
But by the time we encounter the city world, it's near the height of its civilizational power. The planet is completely girdled by its vast cities, and even the oceans have been drained to make space for more development. Basically, you know, Coruscant is a Yimby paradise, right? It's the home of the Galactic Senate and Jedi Order, or alternatively the nexus of imperial control over the galaxy. Despite being the seat of galactic government for literally tens of thousands of years, however, it seems that Coruscant had little in the way of political power over its own future. In the Clone Wars episode, Pursuit of Peace, a senatorial aide is described as living in, quote, a district that rarely has electricity and running water as a result of the war. What?
Dear listener, I need you to understand how absolutely fucked up this part of this episode is. I assume we will come back to it within the next couple of months if my plans bear out. But, oh boy, this is bad. This is really, really bad. Continue, Sophie.
Her children can now only bathe every 2 weeks, and they have no light with which to study or read at night. The Republic has always funded these basic services, but the more cash is poured into the clone army, the less Coruscant itself is able to keep the lights on. From what I can tell, it seems almost like the planet operates as sort of a Washington, D.C. counterpart, ruled directly by the Senate.
Okay, Sophie, I need you to expand on that because not everyone who listens to our show is from the US and knows what that means.
So Washington, D.C., right, is a city, but it's also a federal territory, right? Or a federal district is the technical term. So, if you're a state in the United States, if you're one of the 50 states, what you get is, representation in Congress, and you get to vote for president, and you get returns from your taxes, and also you get your own little state government that controls local affairs, right? Not so for DC. DC is sort of like a US territory in that sense, in that it is part of the country, but it has no political power. They get to send one delegate to Congress, a non-voting delegate, and they can sort of elect their own mayor, but they are directly ruled by the United States Congress, which means that a lot of the time, the fortunes of the city are highly dependent on which party is in power. If people wonder why DC had a reputation for being a real nasty spot in the 1980s, I could give you a 2-word reason for that, and that person's name was Ronald Reagan.
Many such cases.
Many such cases.
It is really evident that Coruscant's governmental situation is a disaster. We very rarely see any kind of interaction with bureaucracy besides corporations, essentially, and like the larger imperial bureaucracy. Like, we see the ISB, we don't tend to see, fuck-ass office of import
Of
and
civil service.
yeah, at a scale like Coruscant's, which I'm sure we'll get to. Abysmal, terrible. We hate it. We hate to see it.
I mean, to be fair, it is functionally impossible to effectively govern a planet of X trillion people.
Well,
but
we'll get there. I do not disagree. Also, with the DC angle, Coruscant is represented in the Senate. We don't really have a lot of examples of the senator doing anything.
They have no meaningful control over their own future because that's won in like literally thousands of votes.
2,000.
Well, like they have influence, right? They have disproportionate influence, some might say, because all of the senators live on their planet.
There's the implication that the senator from Coruscant is like a big wig, but that's all that shows up in Thrawn, the book where I found a mention.
After the fall of the Galactic Empire, it does end up ruled by a provisional government, which would be necessary considering the New Republic's offices of state could be found on Chandrilla. But what powers this body had aren't really well known. So it's kind of like a post-revolution, like Russian provisional government in that it doesn't actually do anything, presumably.
We know that they, again, get a senator into the New Republic eventually. That's it. That's all we know. And we also know that Coruscant's kind of fucked by the time of the sequel trilogy. They're not having a good time.
The Galactic Core forms a belt of rich and powerful worlds, mostly insulated from the power struggles, piracy, and war that reign supreme in the middle and outer rim of the galaxy. On Coruscant, residents are even insulated from the weather. The planet is wealthy enough to pay for weather control to keep it a pleasantly perpetual springtime across the surface. Although it's not known exactly how many people live on Coruscant's 5,127 levels, estimates reliably range... What?
5,127. I said that to my girlfriend earlier. She thought there would be fewer.
Oh.
It's too many. I don't know. I've made my position on Coruscant clear. It's too many. I'm a hater. It's pretty. It's a fun setting. It's terrible. Abolish Coruscant. Get the Death Star laser. I don't care. It's over.
Yeah, let's kill, instead of billions of voices crying out at once and then going silent, let's go trillions of voices just for funsies.
At some point, it's got to all sound the same to a Jedi, How much can you really tell scale in the Force?
I think you can tell like orders of magnitude at least, and that is an order of magnitude greater.
Get your scientific notation out of here.
So, Coruscanti population estimates reliably range into the tens of trillions, although most of the sources we have like to say it's a trillion. We'll get into why I think that's stupid later.
As far as the population thing is concerned, it varies source to source. The 1 trillion number is from the Essential Atlas, which is Legends. There are other sources within Legends that suggest that that is an official census number. It's people who live full-time on the planet.
That is literally impossible. I just have to say, you would have to have 95% of the planet be completely vacant for that to be true at the building density of Coruscant.
Some Legends agrees with you and suggests that with impermanent people who live on Coruscant, that it's 3 times. So it's 3 trillion. loosely.
Still too low. Still too low. Like, once again, that's like 85% of the available space vacant.
The canon book Victory's Price just says that it's trillions, so I don't know, man.
I mean, to be fair, there's a certain extent to which you can't take a census of more than like a billion people. You're just gonna miss so much.
Skill issue. Have you considered just doing it?
Such a vast population naturally led to a huge variety among districts, with whole areas devoted to people sharing a common ancestry. Parts of level 3402, for example, were populated by a large Alderanian diaspora, relocated, and I say that with heavy air quotes, following riots and demonstrations in the wake of that planet's destruction. Other areas of the planet were dedicated to industry or to shopping and pleasure, like the seedy entertainment district from Attack of the Clones. I love to chase Zam Wessel through the entertainment district.
The Uskru Entertainment District. This is a funny naming quirk where some resources will be like, the Uskru District is this entire thing, you know, the stuff on top, which includes like the Opera House, and the stuff on bottom, which is the Outlander Club and the stuff from Attack of the Clones. Other sources will be like, no, actually, like Uskru is just on top and the Entertainment District is down below. And all of this is to say, reference books cannot be trusted with regard to Coruscant because there has at no point been any real definitive like reference book work around this city.
I personally think that they should let me write like the urbanism of Coruscant book. Like I get to make maps of like all the different neighborhoods and I get to, you know, make a giant map of all the train lines and stuff. I think that they should pay me to do that.
Yeah, you get to write the book, The Cost of Free Airspeeder Parking or whatever. No, I don't know. Researching this episode was a little bit bonkers because the stuff about Coruscant that we have is in story material, and there's stuff from the D'Agostini Build a Millennium Falcon series and the fucking Helmets series. Like, absolutely insufferable to have to find some of this stuff. The real meat for researching Coruscant comes from watching and listening to episodes of the Clone Wars, reading books, and it makes it much harder to find this kind of stuff. I mean, this is not stuff that is written with detail about in Wikipedia. Coruscant is obtuse and it's a pain in my ass. And I hate it and it's a bad place to live. Okay, moving on.
Interestingly, large parts of Coruscant's surface and lower levels are somewhat abandoned. Some areas have probably been left to rot after outliving their usefulness, including the Works, a large industrial region near the Senate District, which houses some automated processes but is mostly empty. Coruscant evidently used to be a major manufacturing hub, but it became cheaper to make goods off-world and then ship them in to feed, clothe, and entertain the vast hordes of consumers that make up the planet's populace.
You have to have the Works be abandoned because, you know, then Dooku and Palpatine's creepy,
right, then
scary
Dooku and
meeting.
Palpatine can chill out there.
Yeah, you can have do Maul and Palpatine chill in the Works, or is that somewhere else? It's somewhere on Coruscant that they're walking around.
No, it must be the Works as well, because that's just like the part of the planet that is abandoned. Trademark.
That's where Sheev keeps his apprentices. That's where he keeps his boys. No, I don't know. Is there any like resonance to the idea that it is so much cheaper to make stuff outside of a territory or something? Is that a thing?
It's happened here. Why do you think that we have the Rust Belt in this country? It's because it became cheaper to make everything everywhere else. And so now there's just like God's largest steel mill built in 1846 that built steel for 100 years. And now it's made in like Japan or Mexico instead because it's cheaper. Once again, the most American city is Coruscant.
Coruscant, the most American city.
Importantly, though, how do all these people move around? Coruscant is a truly vast amalgam of urban space, and importantly, one that exists in 3 dimensions rather than the mostly 2-dimensional cities that we're used to on Earth. And because Coruscant is, the most American city, the thing that we know the most about is cars, of course, because the people who wrote it were from Los Angeles, and the only thing they've ever done their entire life is drive. So
cars.
We know a whole bunch about cars and basically nothing else about any other form of transport.
Star Wars said cars. Coruscant graffiti, motherfucker. I guess it would be Coruscanti graffiti.
We know that air speeders and air taxis play a central role, especially in the uppermost levels where there's plenty of airspace to go around. Anakin and Obi-Wan's high-speed chase of Zam Wessel was frankly kind of a dick move. Think of all the commuters whose evening they messed up.
No, not the commuters.
Yeah, come on.
They're hardworking people. You cannot block off people's commute. You can't do it. If you do, you deserve death. You should die.
That's basically a crime. Yeah.
That's my politics. There are a lot of bad things you can do. Genocide, preventing me from getting home in 5 minutes. That's the end of the list. I think those two things are about on par with one another.
Actually, I think the second one is worse.
You know, it is worse for me.
My name is Joanne. I live in Marin County.
It's worse for me, so it's all I talk about. And I've just published an op-ed on the Washington Post.
Which, of course, the Washington Post published. Regardless of terrible speeder driving, though, we do see truly vast amounts of airspeeder traffic and even traffic jams. Yeah, airspeeders get stuck in traffic because they're cars.
It is wild to me that, like, the Jedi Temple on the top of this supposed jewel of the galaxy, and you look out and the main thing you can see is rows of cars.
It's like the equivalent of like a space freeway is the thing that you get to see from the Jedi Temple. Yeah, isn't it great?
I'll ask you like a religion question, Sophie. Are there any like major churches in the US that are right next to like a highway?
There are like 10 Mormon temples that are right next to the freeway.
That's true.
So
that there are.
Yeah, lots of those actually.
But there's only one Jedi temple, so the Mormons are winning, I guess.
So the question here being, what the heck is a skylane, and why has the traffic engineering profession been allowed to continue to exist in the supposedly more enlightened future?
Okay, 3 points. 1, Star Wars does not take place in the future, it takes place in the past. Just kidding. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away is a non-literal statement. You should not take it from your perspective sitting here on Earth today. Anyway, 2, Star Wars does not portray futurist technology. More than anything, it portrays analogs to contemporary technology. Like, look at the ways people eat food, the ways people get around. This is not some sci-fi utopia. It is our real world with some set dressing, and with some set dressing to make it more fun, to make it more palatable, to give it a certain feel, to prioritize certain things, like a relationship to analog technology and certain types of spirituality and all of this stuff. But aside from the stuff that is core to Star Wars, like hyperdrives and droids, all of the stuff on top of that, the stuff that people live with, is meant to be way more like the stuff that we have both now and also like 40, 50 years ago. It's a bit of a mix. Obviously, it's not one-to-one, but just I think it is a mistake to understand Star Wars as portraying futuristic technology, because it doesn't. A skylane is essentially a route programmed into airspeeders. It seems like it's not entirely clear that specifically, especially like personal vehicles used. So, you know, when there are too many speeders, it's more of a queue. It's more of like a line, which is what we see in the prequels. And they are overseen by air traffic controllers who like check permissions and go after you if you're flying wrong. I guess during the Clone Wars, it might be a fucking like Venator doing the air traffic control shit.
What I will say, you drive alone, you drive with Dooku.
There's actually a poster in the book Propaganda that is... I have it here. It says, Narglach AirTech reminds you to slow your speed and share your speeder. Assure our victory. Commute, conserve, contribute.
So what do airspeeders run on?
That's a great question, Sophie.
That we are conserving for the war effort?
So they're repulsor lift tech, so electricity?
Where do they get it from?
The grid?
So just like giant parking garages under all these like Galactic City high-rises with chargers?
Okay, here. Let me quote Propaganda. Republic faithfuls wish to do their part. This is during the Clone Wars. This extended to energy expenditures in such mundane tasks as driving. In the name of rationing as well as security, civilian skylanes were limited to multi-passenger vessels traveling at specific speed limits. On cosmopolitan worlds like Coruscant, this was an unprecedented sacrifice.
Oh no, I have to drive my car slightly slower. This is the worst thing that has ever happened to me.
For those not able to curb the pace of their modern lifestyle, the fast lane was set aside and accessible only to those willing to pay higher taxes.
Based.
So, yeah, I don't know. I think energy.
Energy.
Obviously.
So basically in a skylane, right, you have traffic arranged into different levels along the same route, allowing for truly astronomical levels of vehicle throughput. I have a little photo here, which you can put in there because I believe it's
put in where?
Public domain. Of...
Put in where?
Huh?
We're a podcast.
Oh, fuck, that's true.
What do you think this show is?
Fine, I will make the theater of the mind. And what I have here is a picture of the Embarcadero Freeway, which is a double-decker freeway built in San Francisco in the 1950s. 50s, it has one way of traffic going on the top and one way going on the bottom. And this is like the platonic ideal of the double-decker freeway. Like when I said, you can have traffic going different directions on the same route, like every traffic engineer listening like creamed their pants. The other thing that the source I read mentioned is that crashes are rare since most vehicles run on automated guidance. But I would like to point out two things. One, the amount of computing power that this would take is astronomical. Like running billions of cars in three-dimensional space off of one computer is like just an unfathomable amount of computing power.
Commuting power.
And secondly,
sorry, you said commuting power, not computing.
Commuting power and computing power.
Yeah. We're talking Star Wars. They can make sentient artificial intelligence basically by accident. So, no limits there.
And then the second thing, as someone who is previously licensed to fly an airplane, if the general populace were allowed to fly airplanes, which is basically what's going on here, everyone would die all of the time.
Why?
Do you know how massively the level of complexity increases from driving in 2 dimensions to flying in 3 dimensions? Basically, in a car, you have 2 controls, right? You have the go forward button and the go side to side button, right?
Sure. Kind of.
In an airplane, you have the go forward button, the yaw button, the pitch button, the roll button, and also, a whole bunch of way more complicated instruments to keep track of because your engine has to be going a specific speed and this, that, and therefore. There's a reason you take classes in high school to become a driver and have to go through rigorous training to be a pilot. It's way more complex to fly in 3-dimensional space than it is to drive in 2-dimensional space, even with an autopilot.
Right, but it's not just autopilot. You have to understand, airspeeders are not that complicated. The XJ6 airspeeder that Anakin steals in Attack of the Clones, it's basically just a car. It has an 8-speed shifter, but it's kind of got pod racer,
the problem,
little steery sticks. I don't know what those are called. I'm sorry.
And I guess I formulated the problem wrong, because the problem is not with the controls. Having all those extra control surfaces adds to complexity a lot, but minds that evolved to walk on 2 legs along the ground are not designed to think of themselves moving 3-dimensionally. We're only designed to think of ourselves moving 2-dimensionally. So it's always a stretch and a struggle to try and think of yourself in 3-dimensional space and move accordingly. Having so many people driving airspeeders gives me nightmares.
Well, what I will say about Coruscant is apparently, thanks to the brave work of the men, women, and others of Coruscant Air Traffic Control, crashed airspeeders are rare. You are not going to see them, according to the book Tarkin.
Air Traffic KKKONTROL.
Yeah, exactly. No, I don't know. Have you considered that it's magic? What if it's magic, Sophie? I came up with a solution for this thing in Star Wars, and the answer was that it's magic. All right, continue.
Interestingly, air taxis are actually allowed to just ignore skylanes and zip around and through traffic, making them potentially the fastest way to get around in the upper regions of the city.
I mean, it's like a bus lane, right?
It's like a HOV toll lane, high occupancy vehicle lane, in that you can just move wherever you want.
High occupancy? No, HOV stands for hover. HOV. HOV toll lane. Hover
vehicles only allowed in our toll lane. For the common man, though, an airspeeder is probably not the most common way of getting around. Beyond the insane danger that must exist, I assume that parking on most of Coruscant is at least expensive as it is in New York, that is to say, incredibly. So for normal folks like you and I, that means trains, Airbuses, and your good old-fashioned 2 or more or less legs. We know that the parts of Coruscant where people actually live are generally quite walkable. Even looking at the apartment building where we see Cyril Karn living with his mother after his disgrace on Ferrix, we see that the whole area is designed around walking or rolling as the primary way of getting around. Things are similar on lower levels, with vast bazaars and markets, as well as huge arrays of tunnels that can only really be traversed on foot. Even on the wealthier surface, most areas are probably fairly easy to get around by foot. Remember the nightclub area where Obi-Wan and Anakin continued their hunt for Zam? You didn't see a whole lot of speeders around there, did you? In large cities, you basically have to prioritize pedestrian traffic for the sake of both efficiency and people being able to get around. And Coruscant, the mother of them all.
I'll say.
Mother.
Coruscant is mother.
Coruscant is mother.
Coruscant is an American queen.
We don't have royalty in this country.
But if we did, Coruscant would be one of them.
It also seems that there are decent public spaces, at least on the upper levels, with some sources suggesting that parks and other such areas also exist further down. In the Clone Wars and Chapter 18 of The Mandalorian, there's even a plaza incorporating the only part of Coruscant's natural topography that's still visible, the top of the planet's tallest mountain. There's also the Great Western Sea, which is an artificial body of water on the surface used by the planet's elite for recreation. The surface had museums and botanical gardens, and people of level 3204 had parks and community centers. Obviously, the quality of public space will vary based on level and area, but most people who aren't living in extreme squalor probably have decent access.
I mean, yeah, how good can a park be if you don't have sky?
I mean, presumably they can simulate the sky or something.
I don't think that's a thing. I could really be forgetting about something that is the type of shit that would exist mentioned in a book, and I just spaced it. But, there's a lot of not having the sky in every visual depiction of Coruscant, certainly in canon.
Who needs the sky anyway?
Yeah, good point. Organics, humans.
The sky turns you gay.
Yeah, that's true. The sky is where rainbows come from.
That's right. More excitingly for me at least, we also know that Coruscant has at least some train-based public transportation.
Train adjacent.
Train adjacent. Yeah, that's probably a good description. We see subway and elevated trains in the Clone Wars on multiple levels, suggesting that Coruscant probably has a massive and multi-level system of rail transport. Even the upper levels are well served, as showcased by the hover trains featured prominently in, again, Episode 18 of The Mandalorian.
Yeah, Chapter 18, The Convert, is really out here doing the most.
It really is for us.
Most underrated. I fucking love that episode. People who don't can suck it. I don't care.
That's because you like watching the poor guy get tortured.
No, it's because I like watching Elia Kane.
Oh, his friend, yeah.
It's because I think Katie O'Brien is hot, and that's the main thing. You know what that's called? Standards.
Lesbianism.
Standards.
True.
Tell me about Coruscant trains, Sophie.
They're very confusing for me as a person who is slightly an expert on trains. I'll say that. They have both fare gates, right? You know, in New York City, you have a turnstile that you go through that keeps you from going in, allegedly, if you don't pay, right? So they have that. And then they also have what's called proof of payment, where a guy will come on the train and be like, tickets, please. And having both, a little silly in my opinion, right? Choose.
No, but there's so much crime on Coruscant, Sophie. You have to have both. We couldn't have someone illegally riding the train. What if that train goes somewhere that it wouldn't go for everyone? Get it? Because the train will. It's just gonna go there anyway. Why not just? What I will clarify is that we have seen police on board Coruscanti trains asking for people's passes, and the fare gates that exist in The Mandalorian Season 3 are presumably to check your area clearance in order to go to what is essentially a massive industrial processing facility.
You know, that's much worse, right?
I'm just saying.
That's much worse.
I'm just saying, I don't know. Maybe one checks your passport and the other one is for payment. Maybe one is for payment and the other one, I don't actually know. Again, there's probably a book that mentions someone paying for a train ticket or something, but I have to make that caveat. We are not sure.
Some of them also seem to use locomotives for some godforsaken reason. For those unfamiliar with urban transportation, you don't generally have a big chuggy locomotive pulling your trains in a subway anymore because that's stupid. We have these things called electrical multiple units now that are able to run the cars without having a locomotive. Very silly.
Why is locomotives stupid, Sophie? You gotta say more than that.
Well, because think about a locomotive, right? And you have a certain amount of force that can be exerted by the locomotive. It has to pull its own weight and it has to also pull the cars behind it. Whereas with multiple units, the cars just pull themselves, so it's much more efficient. The engines are in the cars. My next gripe with at least the trains in the Convert is that there's just massive gaps between cars despite these doors that you can just walk through.
Yeah, no, the gaps are terrible. If you can just go out the door as a passenger, the gap is too wide to safely get across. You have to jump, but the like fare checker robots, the droids, the walkway will automatically close.
Yeah, no, it's very stupid. Because if you have a train like that normally where there's gaps between the cars, you just can't get out the doors because they don't want people, getting squashed.
Yeah, either you want people going between your cars or you don't. Like, you can't have it both ways.
They want it both ways here. There's very wide station spacing. Like, they're on that train for like a solid 5 minutes. I don't know what to say about that, but that is a feature.
And that also seems to be the case in the Clone Wars episode To Catch a Jedi. Like, it takes a while to get from one stop to another. And this train is going fast.
And that made me sort of think that the one in the Convert might be a commuter or regional train rather than like a subway train. But then why does it have exclusively longitudinal seating? That's the kind that is like sideways. You're sitting sideways relative to the motion of the train. Why does it have that kind of seating, which is really uncomfortable for long distances, while the more subway-like trains from the Clone Wars have transverse seating, transverse being you face the same direction as the train goes.
The train in the episode Lightsaber Lost has those like horizontal, those transverse seats. And kind of the vibe of that train is that is a train that will take you far away, right?
Oh, is it? Okay, well, good to know.
That's the vibe. I don't know. It's not clear. It seems bigger, even though it doesn't look bigger from the outside. I don't know. I think it's the same model on the outside, but a different model inside. I don't know.
That's all I have really for like talking about the trains because we don't see them very much. But I would like to speculate sort of on how a hypothetical planet-wide transit system would work. Quite similar to how trains work in like large Chinese cities and Paris, right? So you have kind of overlapping layers. You have at the very local level, you have like a subway, right? Like it's a subway, it stops like every half mile. You get on, you get off with your little card. And then in Paris, they call it the RER. That's the regional express railway, which is what we would call an express metro, right? Like it stops like every 2 miles and it goes much faster than the subway trains and it goes way out into the suburbs. And then you have your regional rail, which stops like every 5 miles and then goes way, way out far. And then you have your high speed rail, which goes very fast and very far, right? So if we ever get a more fleshed out version of Coruscant, we're going to have like Tokyo levels of service coverage, right? Where there's just like all different sorts of stuff going on. Perhaps the most striking feature of Coruscant's transportation system, though, and those of Ecumenopoli in general, is the simply gargantuan amount of elevators that are required to make the darn things run. Elevators are really the only feasible way of moving people up and down over any distance much further than a few dozen stories. I don't know if any of you have ever lived in a tall apartment building, but I only live on the 4th floor, and those 6 flights of steps still feel like a lot after taking them on a couple times a day.
Specifically, Sophie, they're not elevators. They are called turbo lifts.
Yes, and we know that turbo lifts are much, much faster than even the fastest elevators that we have in real buildings, but the concept of an elevator running from the top to the bottom of Coruscant is daunting nonetheless.
There are other ways of getting between levels on Coruscant, and those other ways are a big hole that car go down, that the airspeeders go down. So you have these massive circular holes. Like, I don't know if there's any better term for them. Your airspeeders will go down. Let's be clear, not vertically. Like, they don't turn on their end. They fly down horizontally. They just kind of go down like anyway. You have forgotten the crucial element of Coruscant's transit system, big hole that car go down.
Car hole. Well, and once again, right, like car or airspeeder is probably mostly the domain of the relatively wealthy because, as we discussed, parking, right, expensive, as is just owning one in the first place, presumably.
I don't know. It's not like parking is expensive everywhere. Some people just have them. But yeah, I mean, there is less car infrastructure lower down. There's no real reason to have an airspeeder if you're not going to be braving the sky lanes. Like, if you live underneath the surface, it seems like you are way less likely to have a car. Sophie, okay. We are talking about vertical travel. How tall do we think Coruscant is?
So based on some back of napkin math by Ben Chokroon, I'm going to say, we think that Coruscant is probably like 150 kilometers tall. And that's like 31 miles for those of us who are angle-brained.
So the trouble with determining the sheer, I want to say height, but really the depth of Coruscant is that what constitutes a level is not clear at all. A level could be a story of a building. It could be, I mean, there are these shots in the Clone Wars and in art and stuff where you have these huge metal caverns practically with buildings coming down from the top and up from the bottom. And on the bottom is a street, essentially. I assume not every level is that big. 1313, which is like a really infamous level, is, but it seems to me like level heights vary quite a bit. You're definitely not going to have a level under a story, right? It's not going to be under 14 feet, but this estimation
is 30 meters per level.
Right, which I think is a little high, like individually, but because some of these are so massive, I think it's probably reasonable. My biggest hesitation is that actually the Outlander Club, that district, that entertainment district, is supposedly a lower level location, which means they just fell there. You can just fall to the lower levels sometimes. So I don't know. I don't know. It's really hard to tell.
It's hard to tell, and it's very tall regardless, right? So the fastest elevator in the world that we live in, the planet Earth, travels at about 74 kilometers an hour, meaning that it would take more than 2 hours to traverse Coruscant from top to bottom. Slow.
But that's like Coruscant's a world, right? You know, that's not a fun commute. But if you're only doing like a fourth of that, you know, you're going from level 3000 to like 4500. That seems like you could do it. But you're occupying an entire elevator that whole time.
You are occupying an entire elevator, which, as we will come to, is something of a problem. So obviously, you know, turbolifts are much faster than elevators, but even at quadruple the speed, which an astonishing 300 kilometers per hour, it's still like a half hour in an elevator on this theoretical top to bottom lift without any stops. And this doesn't even factor in the time that it would take to safely accelerate and decelerate to and from those speeds without turning the occupants of said elevator into a fine mist.
There is a moment in the Clone Wars where an elevator is in total free fall and a kid presses a button and the elevator stops immediately right before hitting the ground. So whatever they have going...
That would not help.
Whatever they have going on the Coruscanti turbo lifts, I guess saves you from being turned into meal.
They would die, though. Stopping on a dime at 186 is the equivalent of hitting the ground at terminal velocity. Actually, faster than hitting the ground at terminal velocity. So you are dead.
Have you considered that it's magic?
Sorry, I forgot Star Wars magic exists.
Remember, Star Wars has essentially gravity generators, right? So maybe people in turbo lifts are in essentially like escape pods with their own gravity, you know? So they don't get
that
killed.
That could be true. I don't like it, and I think that if you stop at 186, you should get misted, but...
You should. You think it's a moral mandate that people get killed?
It is a moral mandate that you get misted.
In this elevator. Cool. Great. Glad we're being reasonable about this.
But there's another problem that is much bigger than travel time, quoting from Isaac Arthur on YouTube here. The other problem is called the elevator conundrum. The elevator conundrum is a term used to describe the problem that while having elevators allows for tall buildings, they also limit the height of tall buildings since you need to provide more elevators for each floor you add on. Doubling the height of a building means doubling the people in it and slightly more than doubling the number of elevator shafts you need, since those elevators also need longer travel times for the extra floors. Each shaft takes up the same space on each floor, so if you double your elevators, you're doubling the portion of your building given over to it, and again, probably a decent amount more since you need those elevators to spend more time moving to go from top to bottom. So, effectively, buildings over a certain height require more elevators than they have floor space to function. It's one of the major reasons that we don't really see that many buildings over about 80 floors in height.
And the nice thing about Coruscant is that it's planet's width, but it's also planet's population.
And 5,200 floors.
There is no elevator on Coruscant that goes from top to bottom, right? But this is still obviously a problem.
Yes. And this would be a massive problem for Coruscant and its trillions of residents, many of whom probably need to travel between levels on a daily basis. Thankfully, for us, I guess, elevator engineers have come up with a solution called the Sky Lobby system. I've got a little graphic here for your benefit, Eleanor, but everyone else is going to have to imagine this in their mind palace. So in a Sky Lobby system, only express, so you have these in like a 100-story building building, you have 3 sky lobbies, one on the 30th floor, one on the 60th floor, and one on the 90th floor. And only express elevators to the sky lobbies are available from the ground floor. From there, once you get to your sky lobby, you get on a local elevator to your destination floor. This allows the local elevators to share the same shaft space within the building's core, massively reducing the amount of space that elevators need to take up. You can imagine this on a much vaster scale for Coruscant, with super hubs of elevators that lead to sky lobbies where you can then get on local elevators. I can even imagine vertical trains, basically like trains of elevator cars to carry just, huge amounts of people up and down. And this would be basically necessary because the capacity you have to be able to move is immense, as are the distances you have to move them. As we discussed, there are a fair number of rail transit lines in this country significantly shorter than 30 miles.
Well, and the way you're describing this, frankly, makes this sound an awful lot like the Paris transit system that you described, right?
Yes, you have to layer it.
And the real problem with the elevators is Star Wars has artificial gravity that seems pretty easy to come by somehow. Why not just have a sideways train? Why not just have a sideways train? Why does it have to be an elevator?
I don't know. I guess you could just have your train station and it comes in normally so you can board normally, and then it goes up a tube. That is possible as well.
Yeah. Why not just do that? It would be so easy. But instead, your air speeders are going down, fully perpendicular to the surface because everyone in the air speeders are barely even covered. So much of the time, air speeders are just open air. They don't even have windscreens or anything. And they can't go directly down. Trains don't go directly down. Why? What is the purpose, Star Wars? I know the purpose is vibes, but we're not talking about vibes right now.
All this talk of the 5,000 levels, though, brings up the elephant in the room. What about the so-called underworld or undercity, the infamous, crime-riddled dark underbelly of Coruscant's glory? It should be noted that the underworld is not uniformly some horrific, seedy mess. Most of it is just kind of generic humdrum suburbs filled with middle and working class people trying to get by.
Right, it's why we never hear about level 4,000, anything there. Because it's just people.
Right, because that's just where your mom lives.
Right. Cyril? No, his mom lives on the surface.
I mean, they could technically be in a subsurface level, couldn't they?
Technically.
There could just be a light shaft.
There could be a light shaft. That is true. We are running up against the we have no idea what a level is on Coruscant thing, but they have the sun, at least,
Yeah, so they're upper middle class.
Well, yeah, it is really important to say there are, generally speaking, 2 main things that information about Coruscant refers to. One, the government is there, and so there's all this culture and all of this rich people and all the whatever, and then there is crime. That is how it is. It's the overworld, they're rich and they're glitzy and they're corrupt and it's and then everything underneath is crime. And if you go down far enough, there are zombies. That's a Legends thing. But if you go down far enough, there are monsters. That's a canon thing. And this is thousands of levels of normal ass people.
Level 2,500 is probably I don't know, South Salt Lake, right?
I mean, they're probably way poorer than South Salt Lake, and there is definitely more crime, but
So, yeah, technically everything below level 5127, the topmost level known as Galactic or Imperial City, is called the Underworld. Even, the majority of the parts that are just the suburbs.
that do not have literal monsters in them.
Correct. Or tons of underworld activity or whatever.
They're also called the Undercity, which is a little bit less fear of crime politics, but yeah.
Coruscant, even during its purportedly Republican years, was a highly segregated society both by class and by race. Generally speaking, the further up you live, the richer you are, while those who live in the lowest levels suffer in unbearable poverty and literally never see the sun.
Never! Some people have not seen the sun in generations.
There was a source material that said that a lot of them believe that the sun and stars are myths, which is wild.
What says that?
I don't remember, but there was one of your source materials that said that.
Oh my god, that's so fucked up.
Now, to be fair, you can put a positive spin on that, like Asimov's Trantor does, which is that they don't want to because they think it's dumb.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
That's not the reason here.
No, it's bad on Coruscant. It's terrible.
Those below level 2000, which is probably around where the truly dangerous parts of the underworld begin, consist largely of the extremely poor, especially non-humans, who were intentionally left without support from the classes above. They were subject to harsher policing and had effectively no access to social services.
So just to clarify, Coruscant is a very multicultural city, but the demographic breakdown is about 80% humans to a little over 20% non-humans.
Because it is a human world. As we've discussed, it is probably the birthplace of the human species.
It became a human world. Let me just. In Legends, that's not canon. In Legends, the humans had to drive off the other indigenous species. And now it's a human world.
Things became even worse during the Imperial years when many non-humans were ghettoized in what was euphemistically called the, quote, alien protection zone, where they were walled off from parts of the city and regularly harassed by armored guards. So essentially, Coruscant is a nearly perfect representation of the highly ghettoized nature of the American city, and indeed, many cities around the world. Ghettoization is the long-running process of siloing ethnic, racial, or cultural minorities in neighborhoods within a city that they effectively cannot leave safely. The most infamous case might be what the Nazis did to European Jews before they began their campaign of wholesale extermination. They walled them up in neighborhoods within the continent's cities and left them to starve.
And no contemporary regimes have done or are doing this. Notably, it is not an ongoing problem whatsoever.
Not a problem. You know, although things weren't even close to that bad here, thank God, the United States has its own long-running experiments with ghettoization of minority communities. Think of your city's Chinatown or Japantown or Little Russia/Italy/Ireland, etc. Those places, no matter how beloved, began as what were effectively ghettos, the only places in a city where immigrants of a certain nationality could live and work freely and without too much hassle from people who had been there longer.
I have to ask, how do you do that as like a city institution? Like, how does that happen? What are those mechanisms like?
So what happens is normally, right, you have, let's take San Francisco Chinatown, for example. That's like what, 27 blocks just to the north of downtown? You had sort of in the early days of the city, a lot of Chinese people settling there who were coming in to, you know, make a better life for themselves. They settle in this area and then all the white people start freaking out because that area is expanding because a lot of people are moving into the city. And so they're like, okay, well now Chinese businesses are only allowed to operate in this area. And then all the Chinese people have to live in that area so they can live close to their businesses and be with people like them and, you know, effectively. Or it just happens that all the people from an area who are moving into the country just kind of coalesce in an area where they can have sort of safety in numbers. So it can be either like a deliberate policy thing or just something that happens for like collective safety, basically. Mutual defense, you might call it.
Yeah, I mean, if the place that you're in is hostile enough, is difficult enough to navigate, people are going to naturally form those sorts of communities. And those sorts of communities sometimes make sense. But like when it turns into locations where that is the only time you will find someone who isn't white, for example, and where those places are specifically very poor, like that is when stuff really goes off the rails, right?
Correct. Now that you mention non-white. Even worse were the US's experiments with racial segregation in the early to mid-20th century. While white middle-class people were fleeing to the suburbs, the federal government effectively forced African Americans to remain in the crumbling inner cities by only building the social housing that these largely structurally impoverished groups needed to live in the city center.
White flight, baby!
This effectively concentrated impoverished black people into ghettos. Places like the south and west sides of Chicago or the Bronx come to mind. You could also say places like Oakland, segregated from Berkeley, or yeah, just places like that.
Berkeley, end of list.
That was the extent of my like off the cuff knowledge.
that was it. Okay, awesome. You're doing really well.
Planners also intentionally built the new interstate freeway system to cut apart minority neighborhoods and to keep them separate from the remaining white neighborhoods. In some places, they went to almost ridiculous extremes to enforce what is now called segregation by design. In one particularly infamous case, Robert Moses, who is known as kind of the builder and destroyer of modern New York, built a freeway with bridges over the roads that were too low for buses to pass under. The idea being that black people who still relied on public transportation would be effectively unable to cross the line into the white part of town.
Fuck Robert Moses. All my homies hate Robert Moses.
Yeah, you live in Portland, whose freeways are unfortunately a Robert Moses legacy. So
Fuck Robert Moses. I like how the place where I live keeps coming up in this episode.
it really does.
I guess the place where you live also keeps coming up. We live in cities. I don't know. They're relevant.
They are relevant. Overall, very bad news, and we're still dealing with the legacy of this era today. These neighborhoods are more heavily policed and have access to fewer social services than their white or racially diverse counterparts, just like the lower levels of the underworld. Coruscant is an American city.
And listener, you might be sitting there wondering, Daughters of Ferrix, isn't it problematic to use non-humans as analogous to non-white people? To which I would say, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Star Wars does this, and there are ways in which you might explore some stuff, but also, whoa, boy, kind of literally dehumanizing. And then, we've talked about this a little bit before. I'm sure we'll talk about it again. Remember how much of the portrayal of crime in Star Wars, we talked about this 10 episodes ago, I think, how much of the portrayal of crime in Star Wars is racialized. And yeah, Coruscant is a part of that. Way to go, America. We love you. Heart, USA. Patriot.
Yeah. So, having covered sort of the horrible parts of Coruscant, let's talk about some nerd stuff for a couple minutes to sort of cleanse our palates before the episode is over. So I have this under a heading that says Other Problems with Ecumenopoli, which is a very fun word to say, I must say.
Yeah, I have a question. Is that the plural? I thought it was like ecumenopolies or something.
I think it's Ecumenopoli.
Really?
And if it isn't, it should be.
I respect that. You can stick to it. It's the made-upiest of words, like it's whatever. No one ever talks about them except with regard to sci-fi anyway.
That's true. Although Earth could be one someday, inshallah. So number one problem with ecumenopoli is feeding them, right? Because there's no agricultural land to feed the people from. Trantor, from the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov, is quoted as requiring 40 agricultural worlds to feed its population of 40 billion. This is some weird 60s Malthusianism, but how many planets worth of arable land would it take to feed a Coruscant with, say, 3 trillion people, which, by the way, is a crazy low amount of people for the habitable area that probably exists on the planet.
You know that Sophie's getting into actual nerd shit because we're not talking about Star Wars anymore. We're talking about Trantor.
Well, and
we've entered into the Asimov zone.
The reason I say it's Malthusianism is because 40 billion people over the surface of an entire planet is not actually that dense. That's like suburban densities of like 4,000 people per square mile or something like that. It's not that dense, but they think it is because they're insane. And they think it will require 40 agricultural worlds to feed 40 billion people because, the Earth can't support more than 1 billion people without everyone dying because they're weirdo Malthusians. Anyway.
Star Wars does have agri-worlds. They definitely do ship to Coruscant. Now, the vibe is not that there is anywhere near the level of shipping infrastructure and just this huge system that it would take to feed even 1 trillion people, let alone how many Coruscant probably actually has. So that's a problem.
Yeah, getting into some nerd math, Earth's current agricultural output using 48 million square kilometers of land, which is about 44% of the Earth's land area, is enough to feed, according to reliable estimates, about 20 billion people. So about,
oh my God, 20 billion people. There are, 8 billion people on Earth? So no people don't go hungry, right? On Earth. I'm Googling Earth right now because I assume that if we have food output for 20 billion people and about 8 billion people, then everyone should be able to eat enough, like almost 3 times over. I'm just gonna Google Earth. Oh no. Oh no. Oh, okay, moving on.
Yeah, so you would think people might not be starving. So what this means is that to feed a planet of 3 trillion people, we need about 7.2 billion square kilometers of arable land, which comes out to about 15 planets the size of Earth entirely covered in crops.
That sounds kind of true to me. I bet it's actually 30 and they're kind of spread throughout the inner rim. And I think that I kind of believe that. They also probably magically make food from powder that's manufactured in factories on Coruscant or something.
But there's a problem with this.
Oh no.
Given that only about a tenth of the Earth's total surface can actually be used for growing crops, and these planets still have to be able to feed their own populations,
God damn it.
I would be comfortable saying that it would take about 200 Earth-sized planets worth of agricultural production to effectively feed Coruscant. And that's at the 1 or the 3 trillion mark, not the actual one that I think is the population.
The Galactic Republic represents over 1 million planets. We've talked about this.
So this is perfectly reasonable.
What I will put forward is that there are other city planets.
Oh no.
There's like Nar Shaddaa, there's Hosnian Prime, there's Troy from my beloved Alphabet Squadron trilogy. So that's bad. Anyway, moving on.
For a more realistic portrait of Coruscanti population, it could require as many as 2,000 worlds to feed the planet. So,
that's bullshit. I'm a 3 trillion Coruscant population truther.
well, you're wrong. Trantor, on the other hand, could be effectively fed with 4 while sustaining 4 planets with Earth-sized populations. Sort of gives you a scale of how much more ambitious of an ecumenopolis Coruscant is compared to some previous ones. Other questions I have is emergency response. How do you do it when a city is in 3D? Does your fire station have the ability to go up and down? I don't know. I think it's interesting to think about.
You probably have stations on different levels, right? Certainly.
But how do they, like, get to the other levels? Because it doesn't make any sense to have...
the elevator.
With your fire truck?
They fly through Big Hole. They fly fire truck through Big Hole. The fire truck is like a little plane. I've shown you a picture. They bring it out when the invisible hand crashes down. That's why we know about the Coruscant emergency response team. Is just because of that one scene with Anakin crash landing that fucking ship.
Other things. Pollution and pollution mitigation. Does pollution mitigation exist on Coruscant? We sure as hell know that pollution does.
Generally speaking, yes. I mean, the climate is really intensely controlled, right? We kind of mentioned that. There's a joke inclusion in a Legends book that Wikipedia mentions, which is essentially a quote from the musical Camelot saying that, you know, the fog goes away before 8 in the morning or whatever and all this shit. And almost certainly the way that just the monstrous amount of factory pollution is dealt with on Coruscant, and frankly, like the ways in which having as many people as could be on a planet that is this densely constructed has to be down to their climate control systems or something like that.
This one I know the answer to is that there's just a bunch of infrastructure for this, but I just want to everyone to think about for a moment how much infrastructure it would take to handle water, power, sewage, and etc. for 3 trillion to 30 trillion people.
It's a lot of water.
So much water.
Water is heavy too. That there's the weight problem, right? I mean, things are heavy.
How do you build things when you don't know what's under you? Modern skyscrapers require pilings driven deep into the bedrock to hold themselves up. How do you do that when all of the ground below you is already built up for 5,000 levels? How do you build stuff when you do not know what's under you? These lower levels are just not explored, right? Like you can't go down there, you get eaten by zombies. How does that work?
I don't know. You attach it to the stuff underneath and then you stick some repulsor lifts on it or something. It's gotta be dumbass Star Wars tech holding stuff up, right?
It has to, because it's just insane.
And Durasteel is a lot stronger.
Magic.
Durasteel is magic. It is absurd. It's got to be every few levels you just stick a fucking hover platform in there or something.
Just to hold it all up, yeah.
And you have to prioritize with your backup generators just holding the city alive.
Right, like if you miss your plutonium shipment or whatever powers the city, right?
It's not plutonium.
You have to strap the little like Honda generator into your repulsor lift so your entire arcology doesn't fall down. Yeah. Well, you attach your gonk droid to it, I guess, which would be the same thing.
Yeah, just a little army of gonk droids. Oh my god, that's what it is. Every Coruscanti level has gonk droids built into the floor. Gonk droids are the most marginalized entity in Star Wars. Even more than staircase droid. Gonk droids have it harder. Nah, gonk droids get legs. Gonk droids are fine. They can walk around.
Staircase droid be like, I have no legs and I must stare.
I must stare. No, in every floor, in every level of Coruscant, there's just like a little gonk droid civilization. And it's like too short for you or I because the gonk droids are like, 4 or 5 feet tall. But they just waddle around. They have gonk droid civilization. They have like robust cultural practices. They've formed religion. They have a government, and the government, like their main output is like maintaining the structure because this is where they live too. I'm going to say that this is canon and that I should get paid $1 million for it.
And leave it at that. So the final thing I have here is, what is the urbanism of Coruscant? And what I have to say is that what it reminds me most of is 1970s to 1980s New York City. It's a huge city with a ton of people, but in a state of post-industrial decline. Remember all those abandoned districts? There's a lot of glitz, glamour, and wealth in the upper districts downtown, but there are huge disparities between the wealthy downtown workers and people living in the underworlds, also known as the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. And especially Staten Island. Let's be real.
Staten Island, the 1313 of New York.
No, Staten Island's more like level 6 where the zombies live.
Is it time for me to float my dead Coruscant theory?
Go for it.
So this is my like corkboard red yarn conspiracy, is that there's all this text about lower levels of Coruscant being abandoned. Like there is straight up nothing under level 5, anything under like level 200 is like really, really, really bad. I believe that with all of the developer stuff going on with Coruscant, because the degree to which they've built does not reflect our understanding of how populous Coruscant is. This thing is too big just period. And I think that a substantial amount of Coruscant is empty. And I think this is not weird. I think this is the norm. It doesn't even have to be population decline if they're just building up and building up and building up. But I think the surface is largely pretty full up. And there are places in the Undercity that are really densely packed, but I also think there are places where it's fucking dead. And, Star Wars will probably disagree with me on this. If it hasn't already, then it will someday.
I mean, I'm sure in the future someday they'll be like, oh, actually you all were right and there are 30 trillion people on Coruscant.
But if you can count on two hands how many trillions of people it is, then Coruscant is an empty husk. It is this metal ball.
Coruscant is Detroit.
Sure.
It used to have 2 million people. Now it has 800,000. Like half of it is just empty.
And I don't even think Coruscant has to have had population decline. I think it could have had even a booming population if they don't use all of this space.
We're just unable to conceptualize the level of civilizational wealth it would require to have built all of this space and not need to use it. We only build buildings that we're going to use because we are poor civilizationally.
How expensive is Coruscant? I don't know of any instances of people paying rent on Coruscant. If anyone knows, please email us. I need to know about Star Wars rent. But yeah, how expensive is land? Like there are reference materials that say like real estate is expensive. But yeah, I don't know. I don't get the sense that the problem in Coruscant is that the land is too expensive,
So what you're saying is that Coruscant, as we discussed earlier, is a YIMBY paradise because there's so much oversupply that it costs nothing to live there despite it being like the universe's largest city.
Yeah, so if you think about it, Coruscant is actually the best place to live. Just kidding. Fuck Coruscant. Horrible place to live. I will never go there. I recommend no one go there.
Wait, I don't think you could go there if you wanted to.
Exactly. I don't want to. Fuck
Where
it.
you can move, however, is Tokyo.
I can move to Tokyo, where Star Wars Celebration is happening in 1 year's time. If anyone listening is going...
Come to our panel. That may or may not happen.
That's not definitely going to happen. We don't know that that's going to happen. They have to accept it.
I said that may or may not happen.
They might reject us for being woke.
Disney? I thought Disney was the woke incorporated.
They're only woke when it's convenient for me.
Coruscant on those D&D alignment charts is like lawful neutral.
Chaotic evil. Jesus Christ. Coruscant is a disaster. Sophie, is it time for some emails?
It's time for some emails.
Our first email is a very kind one from a new patron, Liam Belson. Liam says, "Hello, Daughters of Ferrix. How are you? I am well. I'm just writing to say that I really enjoyed your interview with Dr. Kempshall. He was a really interesting subject, and you were both really insightful interviewers. Do you have any plans to do any other interviews? I think you're both really good at them. Sincerely, Liam." Thank you, Liam.
I would like to someday get on the show Sheev Palpatine, who is a really central figure in Star Wars political life.
He's really huge to our work, He comes up constantly.
He's very important. Yeah.
I would love to hear what he has to say.
But answering seriously, I don't think we have any immediate plans, but it would be cool someday.
Yeah, I mean, things really worked out getting Chris on our show. As soon as the rise and fall of the Galactic Empire was announced, we started planning when we were going to have Chris on, just because it was probably something that was going to happen on the show anyway, and then we had a really good reason to do it. So I'm sure we're going to have some other people on. I have a couple of ideas. The thing about our I guess field, it's not study that we do, but it's something, is that it's very niche. It's really specific. So we have to find someone that fits into that very well to make an episode out of it. Because Chris was not a guest. Chris was just the episode.
Pretty much.
But I really hope we can do something like that again. Thank you very, very much for your email and your support, Liam.
Thanks, Liam.
Our next email is from Charlie Gates. Charlie sent us an email prior to this one that they said we didn't need to read on the podcast. It's in a similar vein to this one. I really love this email, so we're going to read it now. Charlie says, "Hey, daughters. I enjoyed your most recent episode. I often listen to your latest show while at my job where I work on radios and radars. As an engineer, it stands out to me that in the Star Wars universe, the only focus for everyone's education seems to be practical engineering. Even people like Obi-Wan, who don't seem to care much for ships or droids, know a lot about engineering, to the extent that he can immediately intuit how to shut down the tractor beams on a station he's never been on before. For comparison, that isn't the sort of skill set an earthly monk might train for. Do you think that the galaxy's whole education system is just focused around practical technical skills? Or are there liberal arts colleges somewhere teaching the equivalent of space Shakespeare, and we just don't see that because it would be dull? Furthermore, do you think that a lack of humanities education might have made it easier for a galactic populace to embrace fascism at practically the earliest possible opportunity? Interested in your thoughts, Charlie."
Oh, that is such a good email. I like that a lot.
Isn't it great? Isn't it
I
great?
mean, I don't think that Mon Mothma is going to know how to fix a ship, right? I think that the reason that we think that everyone in Star Wars is so smart with technology and stuff is because all of our main characters are warrior monk heroes who fight wars and stuff, right? Instead of
who fight wars in space, who fly spaceships, right?
Right. For a living.
We're constantly following pilots.
Yeah. So, I mean, to an extent, there probably is a high degree of technical literacy in Star Wars universe, but I think that we have sort of a biased perspective, and that there are certainly, lots of liberal arts colleges and people training psychologists and doctors and things like that as well.
Yeah, there definitely are people who make art and who write and who do politics, and there are lots of jobs in Star Wars, particularly on really dense, populous, inner rim worlds. I bet the Outer Rim has just phenomenal technical literacy because those skills are more relevant. We have a really biased perspective from Star Wars because we're watching guys who are cool and good at that kind of stuff almost always. Not everyone. There are people who don't know how to even basically fix a ship. There are people who don't know how to fly ships, all of this stuff, but it is way more common from our perspective. I don't know if it's the same sort of education demographics as we have IRL. It could be way higher. I mean, George Lucas is this guy who tinkered with cars as a teenager. He cared about that. It's really integral to the spirit of what makes Star Wars. So it absolutely could be more common, but I think you are right to name that we are kind of coming at this from a particular perspective.
Sort of regarding the slide into fascism thing, I mean, it could be. That could be one of the reasons. Although I don't know that there was ever broad support for the Empire.
I mean, there was broad enough support. It's not like the majority of people actively disliked the Empire. Most people just tolerated it. There was, a good chunk of people didn't like the Republic, and they seceded.
The banality of evil.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. And a lot of people did support the Empire, right? The Stormtrooper Corps was made up of volunteers. And they're a dime a dozen. So I don't know. That tells you about how common support for the Empire was. I don't know if I can comfortably say that not having a humanities education makes you susceptible to fascism. One, that's the type of thing that feels kind of impossible to test. And also, I don't know, I'm biased towards humanities educations. I never had a formal one, but it's very much like the water in which I swim. So I don't know. I'm not sure about this one way or the other. Fantastic email, Charlie. Thank you very much for it and for your ongoing support for the show. Our last email is from Coralie. They say, "Hello, daughters. My name is Coralie. Although a longtime enjoyer of Star Wars, I didn't really become a fan until Ahsoka came out this past summer. That's huge. Congrats. Welcome. Since then, I've been watching the animated shows and diving deeper into the lore, mostly for fan fiction writing purposes."
Nice.
Many such cases. Thank you for fighting the good fight. Finding your podcast was a godsend, and your discussions are always so insightful, bridging Star Wars knowledge that I might not have in a conversation with real-world history that I do know about. I just finished listening to your new episode on the Inquisition. Your point about the secularization
Nobody
of...
expects the Imperial Inquisition.
See, it was funny that time. I liked it that time.
Go on.
Your point about the secularization of the Inquisition made me think of a lore detail which has been bugging me for weeks now. Sith eyes. Let me explain. Not every character who wields the dark side of the Force is a Sith, and only a few of them have Sith eyes, but it's also not consistent as to who has them and why. One theory is that you have to be a Sith to have Sith eyes, but Count Dooku doesn't have Sith eyes. Some say it's because he never considered himself a Sith and used the dark side as a tool, but how could he not consider himself a Sith when he was trained by one and given the name Darth Tyrannus? More to your point on the secular Inquisitors, the Grand Inquisitor has Sith eyes, but as you've established, he's not a Sith. Another theory I saw claims that Sith eyes are a reflection of the user's anger when they tap into the dark side, since the eyes are the mirror to the soul. We can see this clearly in Revenge of the Sith on Mustafar, when Anakin's eyes change from normal with Padme to yellow when he faces Obi-Wan. That would explain why Dooku's eyes never change, because he doesn't wield the dark side out of anger like the others. But if that were the case, then a lot more characters ought to have yellow eyes. Inquisitors like Trilla or Reva should have Sith eyes, to say nothing of Shin, who force choked Sabine out of anger in Episode 4 of Ahsoka, yet her eyes do not change. All of that to ask, what do you think about Sith eyes? I know it's more of a cool visual trick than anything else, but as a writer, I deplore its lack of consistency. It has certainly given me quite the headache. Sorry for rambling on. Keep up the good work. I'm looking forward to every new episode. Have a great week. Coralie.
I had never thought of that, but it is kind of weird how inconsistent the Sith eyes are, isn't it?
This is a classic question, and yes, it is weird. Coralie, I'm very sorry that as a writer who cares about consistency, you found yourself in Star Wars community. You're not going to find it here.
No, because we heard all sorts of conflicting things about Coruscant just today, so...
Every single episode. No, I mean, but the nice thing about Star Wars is that we build consistency with the text. I think largely Sith eyes are your relationship to the dark side of the Force in a specific moment. Are you harnessing it in a certain way? Are you using it in a certain way? Coralie, you are right to call out that some people, when they are using the dark side angrily, show Sith eyes. The Grand Inquisitor in Rebels always has them. In Obi-Wan Kenobi, we see that his eyes are sometimes black and sometimes they just go pure gold because he is kind of in the zone, right? It's the Avatar state, but for the dark side. You know, don't take that too literally, please, because I have all of my own ideas about what the Avatar state is. One, we don't tend to see Sith eyes for characters who we're meant to sympathize with. Anakin is the only one whom I can think of. And we don't tend to see Sith eyes for people who will come back. But also, like, Snoke is not a sympathetic character. He definitely uses the dark side of the Force. He doesn't have the glowy eyes. I think part of it is sort of this like almost transcendence through the dark side. I think it's like your relationship to your anger, your interaction with this very metaphysical force, you know. I guess we talked about in the Inquisitor episode, the ways in which Darksiders use the Force. They don't move through the Force. They don't move with the Force. They use it. They claim it and they bend it to their will. And maybe you get golden eyes when you are bending the fabric of the universe to your will, or when your will is like sometime I really want to talk about Sith philosophy. I have some ideas that I've been playing with this week. I really think it is your relationship to like exerting your will over reality or over the Force or over the dark side itself. It's not just using it. It's not just being angry. It is this much deeper and kind of more wicked connection and assertion. Anyway, that's the reason I'm going to go with.
I think that's a good reason.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't, the trouble with this is it's like the easiest ways to prove or disprove a headcanon is to see if there are conflicting examples. And the nice thing about this example is you kind of can just apply it wherever. You're like, oh, that person doesn't have Sith eyes. Well, they're not exerting their will over the fabric of the universe. You know, like that is how that sort of answer works. But also that's kind of how spiritual questions in Star Wars are. Very similar to the Sith eyes question, but kind of more pressing is the question of like, what makes someone able to become a Force ghost? because that's really complicated. If you've seen the Clone Wars, it kind of nods toward one thing, but then Anakin comes back after episode 6, so it must be like a little more possible than it was for but Qui-Gon is just a voice in the Clone Wars, and then he's physically manifests to Obi-Wan, but then Leia's body doesn't vanish immediately, and see. It's tricky, and there might be a story at some point, like a book that says like, this is kind of how it works. And then there will be a TV show that contradicts that book. And then we'll go, well, it kind of seems like it fits in here. And I'm not saying any of this is bad. I think this is a really fun game that we play with Star Wars and with the way these, especially metaphysical things, work in Star Wars. But this is the game. This is exactly how the game functions. And I don't think it's ever wrong to try to play it. It's fine to come up with answers and for them to be disproven. It's part of talking about Star Wars. And it's a part that I really deeply love. Sophie, when do you think you get Sith eyes?
Oh, when you're a cuck.
Okay.
You see, that's why Anakin got them.
Because he got cucked by Obi-Wan. Palpatine gets cucked by...
Palpatine was just mad at Obi-Wan. You see, that's the real common denominator in Sith eyes, is getting cucked by Obi-Wan.
Palpatine gets cucked by the rebels.
No, Palpatine gets cucked by Obi-Wan.
He gets sucked by Obi-Wan? Is that what you said?
No, I said cucked.
Sure you
No,
did.
the common denominator with the Sith eyes is getting cucked by Obi-Wan. Anakin gets cucked by Obi-Wan, and then he gets Sith eyes.
The Grand Inquisitor gets cucked by Obi-Wan.
Darth Maul.
And by cucked, you mean? Do you just mean like punked?
No, I think that Palpatine...
You mean the Grand Inquisitor sat in the corner of the hotel room while he watched Obi-Wan... Okay, yeah, okay, I see it. Quizzy's got his little hands crossed over his knees, and he's just sitting there angrily with his little round head. Oh, God, I love the Grand Inquisitor.
So anyway, that's my opinion.
Thank you very much, Coralie. I hope one of our 2 equally well-considered answers will satisfy you. If you have any questions, suggestions, or corrections, listener, you can send those to our show email, daughtersferrix@gmail.com.
If you want to listen to new episodes as they release every other Wednesday, you can find us on most places you can listen to podcasts. You can find our sources for this episode on our website, daughtersofferrix.com, and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at FerrixPod, FerrixPod.
If you want to support the show, visit patreon.com/daughtersofferrix. I've been Eleanor Mueller. You can find me at The Letter Bomber on most platforms. Sophie, what about you?
I have been Sophia Dunstan. You can find me at my other podcast at @TheRedLine_pod on Twitter.
This episode was written by Sophia Dunstan and edited by me, Eleanor Mueller. Our podcast art is by Jill Mueller. Our intro and outro music was arranged by me, with themes by Nicholas Bertel and John Williams. Thanks for listening.
Daughters of Ferrix, the perfect podcast to listen to on your 2-hour elevator commute on Coruscant.
While you, perpendicular to the ground, descend down big car hole.